All right, here we go with the notes for chapter 24, talking about audio, mainly focusing on radio and on podcasting. When radio hit the airwaves in the early 1920s, I guess we need to say now, radio programming was provided to the public primarily to give it a reason to buy radio receivers. Various companies were behind the motivations to start up these radio stations, manufacturing these radios, Westinghouse and RCA in particular. And in order to get people to buy radios, there needed to be something on the radio for them to listen to. So that's really what kind of got the thing rolling. Now, what about monetizing this? Because, we are business-minded after all, and it's one thing to just sell radios, but then you have to be able to fund the programming that is on there. So the primary business model back in the day was to charge people to talk on the air. It's kind of like making a phone call to lots of people, or even kind of like when you listen to various swap shop types of shows on the air now. It's kind of like just this open line, sort of a free-for-all, and you pay the radio station so much money you can get on the air for X number of minutes and just kind of speak your piece, whatever you want to say. Now, when the station got an inquiry from a real estate developer who wanted to talk about his new apartment complex in Queens, New York, the station charged him $50 and allowed him to talk for 10 minutes. And this pretty much is what we consider to be the first radio commercial. And things kind of took off from there. The current state of radio, well, we have to keep in mind that whenever different technologies come along, we see that it provides the challenge for the current mediums that are out there to either adjust or die. And we see that radio has adjusted throughout its history. It adjusted when television came along. They switched from putting shows and dramas on the air, moving more towards a music format, and then later on news talk formats became popular. Radio also didn't die after the internet. Many people saying radio is dead these days. Not quite true. It still holds a certain relevance. The thing of it is that it still has impressive mass reach. It still continues for the most part to hold on to the revenue that it's been getting from year to year to year. Ever so slight increases, just a slight dip during the coronavirus pandemic, but we're seeing it rebound in more recent years. It's also adjusting by expanding digital offerings and increasing the number of sponsored off-air events, things like concerts and music festivals and that sort of thing. Radio was a difficult sale to most national brand marketers and still kind of is in a way, mostly because they were influenced by the advertising agencies. And the majority of those folks like television. They can get expensive buys with rather little effort as opposed to the amount of work that it takes to be able to sell to various radio stations. Even dealing with some of the larger conglomerates that are out there still takes a good bit of effort. So it's still a challenge to have the local radio station appeal to many regional and national advertisers. Now, here's why, in addition to the love for television, that radio is seldom mentioned by the advertising agencies. First off, radio, not a glamorous medium. Just about anybody can start a radio station and get on the air. Yeah, there's some rather expensive costs, but not near what they are for television in order to get up and going. And then maintenance is relatively cheap compared to television as well. Compared to the cost of creating and producing a TV commercial, creating a radio commercial costs very little, and agencies wouldn't be able to charge clients for producing them, at least not the values that they can for producing television commercials. And it took just a few highly skilled negotiators to execute a $10 million television network campaign, but it can take a whole media department to execute a $10 million radio campaign. So there's a lot more work that goes into making radio work on a regional and national scale as opposed to what it does for television. Now, as far as reach goes, as of 2019, radio has the largest reach of any U.S. medium. It has the most penetration out there compared to television, compared to internet. Print going down and down as newspapers continue to quit making their print editions and moving online. So radio is going to be the best way to be able to reach the most people overall. As far as results are concerned, radio is primarily a local medium, and local advertisers continue to get good results and competitive ROI from radio advertising. Partly because regional and nationals not really all that interested for the most part, but it's also kind of that sense that radio creates this sense of community, especially when you're dealing with the smaller radio stations, and those that can play to that strategy well are able to ingratiate themselves not just to the listening public, but to the local advertisers. And because of the things that we mentioned earlier, that it's rather quick turnaround to do creative and that the overall costs are not near as expensive as television, it's a great playground for the local business to be able to get its word out. New revenue streams include streaming content, concerts, live events, websites, podcasts, advertising, marketing services, many, many other things that radio companies are coming up with. Basically, all of this to say is that radio has finally embraced a multi-platform approach. They're seeing the value of embracing new media and coupling it with the advantages of what radio traditionally has had as its strengths. The radio industry has consolidated cut back office costs to negotiate with suppliers like Nielsen and to negotiate with large national advertisers. So we see this with a lot of the large conglomerates that are out there, your iHeartRadios, your Entercoms, Cumulus and Beasley, and all those different types of folks. Ownership restriction rules, they are out there, but depending on what market you're in, they can be kind of a joke. We talk about this in more detail in other classes, but you can get a pretty good overview from reading in your textbook. For the most part, at maximum, a radio company cannot own more than 8 radio stations in a particular radio market. Independently owned stations continue to decline in number as the large consolidated radio companies dominate ownership of radio stations, and this is especially true in the larger markets. You do have the one-offs here and there in various markets that continue to hold on as an independent ownership. You see a lot more of that in the smaller radio markets, so that those little communities that aren't seen as the larger metros continue to have a voice that speaks out to their neighbors and adjoining towns and things like that, which again is a great strength for radio. As far as how radio is sold, one thing I would encourage you to do, check out the link that's provided in your notes. There's a great little advertisement that was done by Stan Feinberg back in the 60s, I believe it was, that promoted the value of radio and talking about how, using that idea of theater of the mind, to be able to create these pictures in your brain that don't cost near as much to be able to do with just the spoken word and with sound effects and music, as opposed to actually showing those things on a television screen. It's a rather creative ad for the time, and there's that and several others that are provided in that link for you to listen to. Radio salespeople had to sell creatively and emphasize radio's effectiveness based on the medium's ability to stretch listeners' imaginations by using what is known as that theater of the mind idea that we just talked about. Salespeople also sold radio based on the power of the human voice to grab people emotionally, and based on the unparalleled effectiveness of popular local personalities endorsing products by reading commercials live on the air. People that listen to radio, they feel a sense of connection with the people that they listen to on the radio, the disc jockeys, the talk show hosts, and such, almost in the way that we kind of think of how people connect with people on social media today. There's a very similar sort of feel because of the kind of intimate sort of vibe that you can get from listening to radio. Today, radio prevails by not selling radio as an alternative to television or digital advertising, but as a strong combination with these two powerful media. It's a great way to be able to complement associating an ad you hear on radio with something that is seen on television, that you can make that sort of connection and do the theater of the mind aspect with the things that you normally picture on television. It kind of actually helps in such a way that if you're familiar with the television ad, you can bring those mind pictures with you when you listen to an ad on radio. And then as far as digital advertising, there's definitely been a push for people that listen to an ad on radio, for the radio ad to refer to a certain website or social media platform in order to get more detailed information on something. If someone is interested in learning more about a product or service, sometimes it's easier to remember a website address than it is to remember a physical address or a phone number. So it's a great way to complement the online advertising by using radio. Some other benefits and advantages. There's a lot more of these that are listed in the textbook. I tried to pull out some that I thought were unique and relevant. Radio reaches 92% of adult consumers weekly, 91% of millennials weekly, and 87% of teens on a weekly basis. This is hardly a medium in which radio is dead. There's still relevance out there, even though we do have so many options for us for entertainment. Radio is still a, reliable standby. Radio's heaviest listeners are considerably more upscale than television's. They're more likely to reside in a home with a household income over $100,000. They're more likely to have graduated from college, and they're more likely to have been employed full time. People that listen to radio tend to have that certain aura of business-mindedness, of success, of responsibility for family or just their own personal well-being and things like that. And advertisers love to reach out to those kinds of people. Precise targeting is not a substitute for mass reach. Marketers' livelihoods depend on reaching a lot of people. To try to persuade a few of them to include the marketer's brand in their consideration set and to purchase it. So here, while we do talk a lot about how radio has broken up into different formats, they are rather general formats compared to what you may see in online media, but there's still these different niches that are out there. But they cover a broad swath of those different niches. Country music can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but if you've got a one-stop shop for everything country, you've got a larger audience with various demographics that you can reach out to, and for some, that could be a strength. Radio, again, also an intimate medium, as it's seeing that we are living in a world where we're becoming so much separated from others, where we do kind of go off and do our own thing, have our own thoughts and ideas, and enjoy our own preferences for entertainment. But we're also doing those things a lot on our own. We're just interfacing with the computer and telling it what our preferences are. There's at least a sense of some sort of personality and relationship that happens when dealing with radio. Radio reaches consumers in places that other media cannot, often while they are a mobile or a captive audience. Most radio listening happens in the car. And other times people listen to radio would be while at work, whether they're listening to an actual radio or the online stream of a radio station. Some people still listen to radio when they go out and they take their walk or their jog or something like that. So generally, you're dealing with people that when they're listening, that's what they're doing. They're listening, and many times they're doing it while they're doing other things. So because of that, it may not be as convenient for them to switch the dial whenever a commercial comes on, unless they are driving in their car. It's a little easier to do that. But in general, you're dealing with folks that are captively listening and choosing to do so. And radio is the most trusted medium compared to television and to social media, at least from a commercial standpoint. We are seeing in social media that more and more people are trusting what we would consider to be regular folk that we can kind of develop that relationship with and have a certain affinity for. But because that value is still there in radio, especially when it comes to personalities, and we associate our favorite station with them kind of identifying with us and our preferences and things like that, there is more of a trust that comes to listening to ads on radio as opposed to viewing an ad on television or seeing your basic ads that are not social media influenced looking online. Someone trying to take advantage of us in the online world. Now, podcasts. How podcasts are sold. Advertisers, especially different marketers, find podcast audiences highly desirable and their commercials very effective, especially when read by a podcast's host. So in this way, that intimate field that we identify with different radio personalities especially comes into play when we have our favorite podcast hosts that we listen to and we feel a connection with them. Many podcast hosts promote that they will only do advertisements for companies to which they've actually used the product or they believe in the product that the advertiser is selling or perhaps identify with a cause that company aligns with. So it creates a more quote-unquote authentic sort of feel to when you hear an ad on a podcast. Now, how do you measure podcasts in terms of determining for advertising purposes which podcasts are good to go with and what's valuable? Now, besides number of downloads, there are a couple other things that we can look at. There's the number of unique downloads. You can kind of think of this as podcast cume, the number of unique earlobes that a podcast is reaching out to. There's measuring based on number of subscribers. The larger the number of consistent downloads, the larger the subscriber base probably is. And you can look at the first 2 to 3 days after a podcast is published in terms of how many times it's been listened to, how many times it's been downloaded. And that kind of gives you a sense as to how many loyal listeners there are and give a rough estimate as to the number of subscribers. Not everyone that listens as soon as a podcast comes out is a subscriber, but it's usually a pretty good indication. And then context, looking at the number of downloads compared to how niche or general the podcast content is. So that's also going to make a determination as to what sort of companies are going to be interested in what particular types of podcasts. Obviously, the more niche a podcast is, there's going to be a limit on the types of companies that are going to be interested in that. But those companies are going to be really interested in that because they know that they're reaching out to their kind of people. Other forms of measurement include lead generation. This is where advertisers put a podcast link on their website that a podcast will promote in order to track the number of conversions. So, if you're listening to, say, Mike Rowe's podcast, the way I heard it, when he does an advertisement on the podcast, it will usually be www.website.com/Mike Rowe. And that's a way for them to be able to measure how effective the ad is on that particular podcast. And then you have reviews and likes. These are helpful to advertisers and to podcast producers to get a sense of listener engagement and loyalty. And because the social media world is such an interactive one where there is give and take between the content creators and those that follow such content, there's a real strong association between them, and for people to share their like or dislike of something shows that there is engagement with that podcast, and that's something advertisers are really interested in. As far as structure of podcasts, most podcasts are going to air ads either pre-roll, right before the podcast starts, mid-roll, somewhere in the middle, and then post-roll positions as well after everything is said and done. Podcast pricing, generally, there's going to be three models here. There's going to be a cost per thousand model. So this is kind of based on the number of unique downloads. You're paying a certain price per 1,000 downloads. There's also cost per acquisition. This is based on the number of customers that are sent to and who take action on a website. So those various conversions, for example, how many people follow that web link to get more information or to make a purchase. And then there's also the flat rate sponsorship basis. This is kind of the more traditional model. You want to put an advertisement on, it costs X number of dollars. This sponsorship model works well for podcasts just starting up and don't have a track record of downloads or listener information. A couple other notes here. The IAB Podcast Upfront. This is a major marketplace for major podcast publishers and large national advertisers. So those podcasts that strongly associate with groups like iHeartRadio and Spotify and some of the other networks that are out there, they are kind of taking a page from the network television playbook and showcasing what new or recurring podcasts are going on and getting advertisers to buy. Some podcast networks that are out there are going to concentrate on selling podcasts with similar content, but most networks sell the aggregated mass audience of all the podcasts that they represent. So this kind of depends a little bit on whether you've got a type of podcast network that focuses on a certain subject matter or a certain type of audience, or those that just have everything available and aggregate all of those things. And an advertiser may choose the ability to advertise on one type or another. Some of those that do have the mass audience appeal but offer different niches of podcast content can also break down things in terms of whether you want to reach out to anybody and everybody or you want to reach out to a specific audience. The future of podcasting. Well, we're seeing more and more consolidation in the podcast space. We're seeing more and more people get into the podcast space as well. They're going to consolidate, and in the future, there will be fewer and fewer small players and just a handful of large players that remain in business, as more and more content creators that are seeing a certain amount of success choose to join a particular platform network. As far as subscriptions, more and more publishers of podcasts are probably going to adopt a subscription model and then charge for podcasts, or at the very least offer premium types of content where you can listen to podcasts on an ad-free or a limited ad sort of basis. We're seeing that work well with video streaming, and we're going to see more and more of that come in the audio landscape as well. What about work, selling podcasts? The future of sales jobs is not going to be in selling individual or a small network of podcasts, but in selling for large companies to be able to offer advertisers all sorts of different types of content. The small podcaster is probably going to be left to selling that podcast himself or herself. That's the chapter. I'm sure many of you will have different thoughts, especially as it comes to the podcast space, but we can relate that to radio and audio in general. Different things happening in the world, in the evolution of streaming media, live media, and recorded or podcast media. So we can talk about those things, how it relates to monetization and making money and selling yourself and having others sell for you and all that sort of thing. Bring your thoughts, bring your questions to class.